Hi everybody, I'm Rui. I'm here to talk about hydras. Let's talk about monsters. The hydra is a creature that was first described in ancient Greece. It is a serpent-like monster that lived in a lake. If you don't recognize that guy, you may recognize one of its many, many pop culture iterations. Now, these share several common factors. They tend to be snake or dragon-like, they tend to have multiple heads, and they tend to be very, very hard to kill. Now, this is because the original ancient Greek hydra had this interesting property, where if, in an attempt to get rid of this creature, you cut off one of its heads, it would actually grow two more. This made it so tough that Hercules himself could not get rid of it on his own. I'm here to tell you, with complete honesty, that my day job is cutting the heads off of hydras and watching how they regenerate. Now, as you've probably noticed, I do not have the rippling muscles of an ancient Greek hero, so I'm sadly not up to wrestling giant snakes. My hydra is a little less physically intimidating. This is my guy. He's a little freshwater cnidarian, about up to a centimeter or so long, lives in freshwater all over the world. You may not know of the hydra specifically, but I'm betting that you do know of some of its cousins, which are other cnidarians like jellyfish, sea anemones, and corals. So these are soft-bodied animals with stinging cells. So let's take a closer look at the hydra. It's a pretty simple creature. For starters, it only has two tissue layers, an endoderm and an ectoderm, stuck together with matrix. And if you look at its anatomy, it's also very simple. On one end, it's got a head with a mouth and tentacles that it uses to eat. On the other, it has a foot that it uses to stick to the floor, and in between its body is basically just a tube. So, in line with its mythological name, this thing does regenerate. If you cut off its head, it grows a new head. One new head. If you cut it in pieces, each piece will regenerate a new hydra. However, I'm here to tell you that in some ways, this little thing is actually a lot worse than the monster it's named after, because it turns out that I can take this animal, I can take it apart into single cells, okay? And if I lump enough of these cells back together and give it a little bit of time, it will actually put together an entirely new hydra. This is completely wild. This is like comic book level shenanigans right here, okay? I want to know how they do that. How is it that I can take this animal, scramble it like an egg, and it actually comes back? So this is actually really interesting, because how you form complicated patterns like, an animal's body plan from an initially very simple or disordered system is one of the key problems in biology, and Hydra's a really cool model system to study that. All right, so let's look at this process in a little more detail. Here is a Hydra regenerating from a blob of cells. If you watch this thing, it seems to be pulsating, right? What's happening there is you've got a hollow ball of cells, and water is seeping into it, but because it's got no way out, the sphere will inflate up to a certain point, and then it can't take it anymore. It pops like a balloon. It shrinks down, and then it does this over and over and over again until it regenerates into a whole new hydra. So, if we look at that process and we plot the size of this animal over time, we get something like this. This is my actual data, all right? So you can see the thing is gradually increasing in time as it takes on water, suddenly decreasing as it pops, and then doing this over and over. Moreover, if you look at this plot, you will notice an interesting pattern, which is to say that these oscillations go from big ones to little ones. There's a very sudden switch halfway through. People studying hydras have noticed this before, so they made several key assumptions based on this. First, that pattern shift always happens, okay? So every time you get a hydra regenerating, you always see this shift from big oscillations to little ones. Second, that pattern shift has something to do with the animal defining its body axis. The idea is that when it's doing the big oscillations, it doesn't yet know, say, which end is going to be the head and which end is the foot, and once it figures that out, it switches over to small oscillations. If true, this is super cool, because now we have this direct handle on the animal deciding its body axis. If you are a happy, optimistic grad student and you decide to do your entire thesis on hydras, and you start looking at hundreds upon hundreds of regenerating hydras, you're going to notice something that makes you very, very unhappy, which is this. It turns out it is completely possible for a Hydra to regenerate without ever showing a shift in oscillation pattern. You get something that looks like that. That's a problem. So right off the bat, we have shown that that first assumption was false, which means that now we have to think really hard about the second one. If that pattern shift is not a requirement for setting a body axis, what is it? And why does it happen? So as I'm like sitting there in the middle of the night being really upset about this, I start thinking, and it's like, okay, the thing ruptures, right? It pops like a balloon and deflates. By definition, that is a hole opening up in this hollow sphere, right? And if you think about the adult Hydra, there is actually a structure that does this, and that would be the mouth. This is a top-down view of a Hydra's head. The Hydra's mouth does not look a whole lot like ours. It's pretty freaky. But it does open. Specifically, it opens when the animal wants to eat, and it opens to release water from inside. So that sounds like a pretty promising candidate, right? So the question now is, does the mouth cause the pattern shift? Because specifically, we would expect that blob of Hydra to start out without a mouth and then develop one at some point. So the easiest way to check this is to grab a piece of tissue that has a mouth like pre-formed in it. And thanks to the nature of Hydra, this is pretty simple to do. You just cut a piece from the tip of the head of a Hydra, and then look at that, because that contains the fully formed and functional mouth of the parent animal. So if we look at the oscillations of this guy, this is what we get. These are really small oscillations. So in summary, yes, the mouth does have something to do with small oscillations happening. That's great. We're not done here, because we haven't answered what it is about the mouth that causes this, right? Okay, so think about your mouth, for instance. You have the physical structure of the mouth. That's one thing. But if you want to like drink your free beer or give a talk about Hydras, you have to like actively move and control that mouth. So these are two completely different aspects, and if we want to separate them out and determine which one is important, we actually have to completely divorce them, which, if you think about most animals, is going to be pretty hard to do. Thankfully, Hydra isn't most animals. I can, in fact, disable the mouth of a Hydra by taking this animal and murdering every single last one of its nerve cells, which gives you something like that. So if you look at the nerve-free Hydra on the right, you're going to notice that it looks like, well, pretty messed up, but it's kind of inflated and stretched out, and this is because it can no longer open its mouth to let water out of the animal, which leads to it inflating like that. Now you might say, like, okay, that's great, you kind of got what you wanted, but you've also like doomed this animal. It's just gonna die, because if you think about it, most creatures don't do so hot without their nerves. It turns out that the main long-term problem with these animals is they can't feed themselves, right? So if you do the feeding for them, you take the little shrimps they like, and you take tweezers, and you put them inside the Hydra, it'll actually digest those, and they'll live almost indefinitely, and they'll actually multiply. So great, we can use this guy. Now, back to the original problem. If we take now the mouth of this animal, if it's just the structure that's important, we should see exactly the same behavior as the mouth of the normal animal. If, however, function is needed, then we should see something different. So when we actually look at that and plot the oscillations, here's what we get. Look at how big those are compared to the normal animal up there. So specifically, it is definitely mouth function that causes that oscillation pattern shift and not anything to do with axis formation. So that's really cool because, one, I've debunked an incorrect assumption that the Hydra field has been holding for about 10 years at this point, and two, by doing that, we're now a lot closer to understanding completely how regeneration works in Hydras. Now, you might ask, why should you care? This is a totally valid question. I've just spent 10 minutes ranting at you about this little two-layered ball of tissue pulling weird tricks. Okay, two-layered ball of tissue. What else does that sound like? Sounds a lot like the gastroless stage of an embryo, right? That's also something that has to go from a formless ball to something that has, a body plan. And it's not just shape. Hydra actually shares a lot of the same genes and proteins as even humans have got. So, I crack pattern formation and regeneration in Hydra, and someday that could be applied to more complicated animals like all of you.